Committee will please come to order. Quorum being present, the committee meets today pursuant to consideration of H.R. 582, the Raise the Wage Act. The committee announces that any requests for recorded votes may be rolled pursuant to Clause 2, Rule 11 of the Rules of the House of Representatives and Committee Rule 13B. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 1, the chair may recess the committee at any point. I now recognize myself to make an opening statement. Today we're here for a legislative markup of the Raise the Wage Act, H.R. 582, a proposal to gradually raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2024. It is my strong, long-held belief that we should make policy based on evidence and research, not slogans and sound bites. And when it comes to raising the minimum wage, the studies are clear. Gradually raising the minimum wage is good for workers who experience a better living standard, good for businesses, which benefit from having more customers and less turnover, and good for the economy, which is strongest when we lift working people out of poverty and build a thriving middle class. And studies have shown that there is virtually no job loss when we raise the minimum wage. After nearly 10 years with no increase in the federal minimum wage workers have suffered a 17% pay cut due to inflation. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, today's minimum wage worker making $7.25 an hour has 28% less buying power than a minimum wage worker had in 1960. That's adjusted for inflation. The result is that there's no place in America where a full-time worker who is paid the current federal minimum wage can afford a modest two-bedroom apartment. And so we can't ignore the consequences of inaction over the last 10 years. If Congress fails to raise the minimum wage by mid-June, it will be the longest period of time without an increase since the minimum wage was created approximately 80 years ago. We now have an opportunity and a responsibility to restore the value of the minimum wage, lift millions of hardworking Americans out of poverty, and boost the economy of Main Street America. The Raise the Wage Act will achieve that goal in 3 ways. First, it gradually increases the minimum wage in 6 steps to $15 by 2024. Second, it ensures that every worker covered under the law is paid at least the full minimum wage by creating one fair wage for all workers. And third, by tying future increases to a percentage of the minimum wage, of the median wage. This bill ensures that future increases in the federal minimum wage will be determined by economics and not by politics. A report recently published by the Economic Policy Institute details the sweeping benefits of this bill this bill would have for workers in each one of our districts across the country. For example, if we pass the Raise the Wage Act, close to 40 million Americans will receive a raise. They include 23 million women, 2/3 of America's working poor, and parents of over 14 million children. So the benefits of this bill will play out positively in each of our communities. The Raise the Wage Act will stimulate local economies and local businesses across the country, whereas the recent $1.5 trillion tax bill gave the largest benefits to those who needed it the least. This bill puts money directly in the hands of those who not only need it, but are also most likely to spend it in their communities. Over the 6-year phase-in period, the increase in the minimum wage would generate over $100 billion in additional wages, much of which will flow right back into local businesses. For 80 years, every time we propose raising the minimum wage, opponents recycle a similar set of talking points that have been repeatedly contradicted by evidence, research, and experience. Today, I'm confident that we'll hear dire projections about job losses that would result from gradually raising the minimum wage, but these projections are not grounded in research. The overwhelming majority of studies from both left-leaning and right-leaning labor economists find few, if any, jobs are lost when we gradually increase the minimum wage over time. For example, a widely acclaimed study published by the National Bureau of Economic Research examined 138 minimum wage increases between 1979 and 2016. This study found that the overall number of low-wage jobs remained essentially unchanged over 5 years following the increases, and there was no evidence that gradual changes to the minimum wage led to higher levels of unemployment. These findings were echoed by a recent study that projected the impact of a $15 minimum wage by 2024 in Mississippi. The report found The report found positive effects on consumer spending from workers receiving wage increases without generating any adverse employment effect. In fact, the report estimated that there would be a small cumulative net gain in employment of 2,000 jobs in Mississippi if the minimum wage were gradually raised to $15 by 2024. The research clearly demonstrates that the Raise the Wage Act is a reasonable proposal that will lift millions of workers out of poverty. By 2024, $15 an hour is the least a person would need to be able to afford the basic essentials in most parts of the country. This includes rural and southern parts of the country. Workers should not be forced to work for poverty-level wages regardless of where they live. The Raise the Wage Act would restore the original intent of the Fair Labor Standards Act, and that is to ensure that all workers have a minimum standard of living. As President Franklin D. Roosevelt stated, and I quote, "Our nation, so richly endowed with natural resources and with a capable and industrious population, should be able to devise ways and means of ensuring to all of our working men and women a fair day's pay for a fair day's work." Gradually raising the minimum wage to $15 by 2024 is good for workers, good for businesses, and good for the economy. Last November, voters in both Arkansas and Missouri voted to increase the minimum wage, and so I urge all of my colleagues to do the same today by supporting this legislation. And now I yield to the distinguished ranking member from North Carolina, Dr. Fox, for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. What happened to liberal pragmatism? Truly, I'm asking, what happened to it? In the past, I could appreciate the positions of my colleagues across the aisle, and I understood their reasoning for much of the legislation they proposed. I disagreed with many of these proposals, but the arguments followed some degree of logic. There's no logic to this legislation. We're here to mark up a socialist campaign talking point. This proposal defies all logic put forward by our last two Democratic presidents. During President Clinton's presidency, his entire economic team advised him against a 40% increase to the minimum wage, far short of the 107% increase being proposed today, because it would, quote, prove damaging to the employment prospects of low-skilled workers as well as the general macroeconomic performance of the economy, end quote. To be clear, low-skilled was their term, not mine. The workforce needs skills of all levels and specialties now more than ever, which is why shutting anyone out of the workforce is simply unthinkable. When the $15 an hour federal minimum wage talking point began to generate a headline buzz, the chairman of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, Princeton economist Alan Kruger, warned that the proposal would, quote, risk undesirable and unintended consequences, end quote. Going from a $7.25 an hour federal minimum wage to a $15 an hour minimum wage is, at best, a foolish policy proposal. At worst, and it's an intentionally dishonest political stunt that promises bigger paychecks to hardworking Americans, when in reality it would result in significant job losses for millions of hourly workers around the country. The workers this bill would hurt the most are those who develop their skills as they spend more time on the job, such as workers without a GED or skills certificate, as well as tipped employees who, as a rule, make more with tips than they would with a mandated $15 an hour minimum wage. Every decision this body makes has real-world trade-offs. Every action has a reaction, and this action would decimate so much of the economic progress achieved under united Republican leadership. H.R. 582 will hammer small businesses and mom-and-pop shops. It will push hundreds of thousands of able-bodied, talented individuals out of the workforce over the next decade. It will result in millions of jobs being eliminated for vulnerable members of the workforce, like single working moms, workers without a high school diploma, and entry-level employees. Those most likely to benefit are big corporations and skilled workers. Corporations because they can absorb the added cost, and skilled workers because they're in-demand employees. H.R. 582 is a bad bill, plain and simple. There are many, many ways to encourage wage growth for workers, as we've seen over the past 2 years, without resorting to a federal mandate that will inflict misery on just as many people as it marginally helps. In an interview, President Obama's Federal Reserve Chair, Janet Yellen, said, quote, "Real wage growth will be faster in a tight labor market. So disadvantaged workers gain on the employment and the wage side, and to my mind, that's clearly a good thing," end quote. These are the facts. The U.S. job market and economy are thriving. The economy has added jobs for 100 consecutive months, with millions of new jobs since Donald Trump was elected president. Unemployment recently hit its lowest point in 49 years. Wages are up and showing sustainable organic growth thanks to the Republican Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The percentage of workers making at or below minimum wage is just 2.3%. I want to repeat that. The percentage of workers making at or below minimum wage is just 2.3%, and that percentage has been steadily falling each year since 2010. In a special Wall Street Journal report from last week, nearly 3/4 of 166 business sectors they reviewed saw gains in employment and earnings last year. According to the labor market data, median weekly earnings are up more than 30% for Latino and Asian workers since the end of 2007. Black and white workers have seen increases of more than 20% in weekly earnings over the same time period. Instead of advancing a blatantly socialist bill, members of this committee can and should push for higher wages for American workers through strong evidence-based policymaking to strengthen the workforce and make this continued economic growth possible. I urge my colleagues to oppose H.R. 582, and I yield back.
Thank you. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written opening statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically by the end of the day today. House rules require that a copy of the text of a bill offered for markup be made available to members and the public at least 24 hours in advance. Pursuant to Committee Rule 12E and discussed by the committee's organizational meeting and pursuant to today's notice, the chair plans to use the amendment roster system to improve transparency and the opportunity for full deliberation of amendments from both sides of the aisle. To facilitate that process, a copy of the text of today's bill was made available to members and the public over 48 hours in advance. And so the chair will give priority to amendments under the roster system to amendments submitted to the committee at least 24 hours in advance. Amendments not offered in advance will be entertained, but unfortunately neither the committee nor the public will have a chance to fully review or consider them in advance in order to prepare informed responses to either the substance of the amendment or its procedural posture. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of the bill, H.R. 582, for amendment. The first clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 582 to provide for increases in the federal minimum wage and for other purposes.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of the bill for amendment. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk has designated the bill. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Without objection, we will now proceed to the second reading. The bill will be considered as read and opened for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. I now recognize myself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk shall designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 582, offered by Mr. Scott of Virginia.
Without objection, the amendment shall be considered the original text and open to amendment at any point. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. Now recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The amendment clarifies H.R. 582's language to fully repeal the youth subminimum wage in Section 6G of the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA, in 2027. Due to a drafting oversight, H.R. 582 was introduced did not fully repeal Section 6G of the FLSA. In particular, it failed to capture the provisions added to the act by the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act in 2016. These provisions extended the $4.25 youth sub-minimum wage for those who are under 20 to those who are under 25, and authorized the governor to extend its application for 4 years, which he has not done. The amendment in nature of a substitute also adds provisions pertaining to the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. First, the amendment sets the effective date of the minimum wage increases to 18 months after the general effective date. Second, the amendment requires the Government Accountability Office to review the economic conditions in the Northern Mariana Islands, estimate the portion of employees directly affected by such wage increase, and submit a report to Congress within 1 year after the bill's enactment. These provisions are in line with prior action of Congress that was taken with respect to the application of the federal minimum wage in the Northern Mariana Islands, which only became subject to the federal minimum wage laws in 2007. And so under the amendment in nature of a substitute, both Puerto Rico and the Northern Mariana Islands will have the $15 an hour minimum wage, but on a slightly delayed timetable to reflect prior actions of Congress. Are there members who wish to be recognized for further discussion of the amendment in nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. I'll be brief in my comments on the amendment, which in all due respect no way improves this bill. Ranking Member Fox pointed out several major flaws in the bill, and I agree with her assessment. We only had one hearing on this topic, but let's go back to one of the statistics that tells us a lot more about the job market right now. The percentage of workers making minimum wage is less than 3%. That's not because we have a low percentage of entry-level or hourly jobs in this country. It's because not every employer is paying minimum wage. They're paying over minimum wage, above minimum wage, more than minimum wage, however you want to say it. It's a job seeker's market right now. Businesses know if they're going to get good workers, they better pay them well. These pay increases didn't happen as a result of any command from Washington. They're a direct result of mandates finally taking a backseat to economic policies that empowered individuals and small businesses. That's one of the reasons we need to take the job loss projections with this bill seriously. Rural Americans, like I represent, take the hardest hit when the economy loses jobs. Americans who live in cities and towns without diverse industries suffered the most under the recession. Estimates show Michigan would lose more than 57,000 jobs starting next year if the $15 mandate went into effect. We've heard a lot about jobs that have been lost in Seattle, and that should be enough to scare anybody. But the jobs that would go away because of this mandate wouldn't just be in the big cities. They'd be in communities I represent like Monroe, Jackson, and Charlotte. So what would be fair for everybody? Everyone here knows that the costs of living are not the same in every city, state, and community in this country. So what would help grow wages in Michigan, Tennessee, South Dakota, Virginia, and everywhere in between at the same time? It looks like we've already figured that out. Republicans recognize that tax reform and regulatory relief would unleash historic economic growth, and it has. There is no debate upon that. This legislation is a calculated move in the opposite direction of tangible, widespread economic progress for Americans in every community in this country. That's why we should oppose it and go back to work that actually helps the people we represent. And I hope we do, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other comments? Gentlelady from Pennsylvania. It's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am proud to speak in support of the Raise the Wage Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in the House of Representatives on May 24th, 1938. with 314 voting in favor and just 97 opposed. Even after amendment in the Senate House Conference Committee, the House again passed the bill 291 to 89. The codified purpose, a purpose shared overwhelmingly by both Democrats and Republicans, was to protect workers from substandard wages that were detrimental to the maintenance of the minimum standard of living necessary for their health, efficiency, and general well-being. Mr. Chairman, we have failed to carry out the Fair Labor Standards Act's purpose. Worse, we have failed workers. Workers like Terrence Wise, who appeared before this committee, a young man who spoke with great pride about his work, but wasn't afforded the dignity of a livable wage. A young man who, despite working multiple jobs, lived out of a van with his fiancée and 3 daughters and felt the shame of dressing his children in a parking lot rather than in the privacy of their own home. You could hear it in his voice. He wanted to break the generational poverty that had enveloped his family. We need to stand with him in this fight for his dignity and for the dignity of workers across our country. Let's not fail Mr. Wise today. Sadly, my state, Pennsylvania, is one of 22 states that have not enacted legislation to set a floor greater than the current $7.25 an hour national level. When adjusted for inflation, $7.25 per hour is actually less than the federal minimum wage of 50 years ago. With corporate profits at an all-time high and wages stagnant, we have a duty to ensure that the low-wage workers who generate this wealth are paid a living wage. In my district, the Raise the Wage Act would give 98,400 workers a raise. The total aggregate wage increase in my district would be $308,414, amounting to an average annual earning increase of $3,100 per worker by 2024. That means 98,400 workers with greater buying power in my district alone. For context, in the last 40 years, Congress has passed just 4 adjustments to the federal minimum wage. Only 4 adjustments, even as healthcare, housing, childcare costs, and tuition rates have all increased. During that same 40-year period, Congress has voted themselves approximately 20 raises, and through many of its policies, has voted corporate executives and donors even more substantial raises. I implore my colleagues to recommit to the FLSA's original purpose, a purpose that should not be controversial or partisan. Let's recommit to giving our workers a chance to lift themselves and their families out of poverty. Let's finally start taking on the record income and wealth inequality across our country and get to work building an economy that delivers for all workers. Let's pass the Raise the Wage Act right now. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time is expired. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. I started my first business over 40 years ago. It has been my greatest honor and privilege to create jobs so that my employees are able to provide for their families, their communities, and churches. As a small business owner, I know firsthand why heavy-handed federal one-size-fits-all policies do not work. As I've said many times before, my home state of Georgia has been named the #1 state to do business in 6 years in a row. I believe that states, localities, and the business community are in the best position to work together to address wage issues within their states. Wages are growing at the fastest rate in a decade thanks to our Republican Tax Cuts and Jobs Act without radical federal mandates. Our hot economy is putting more money into people's pockets and creating opportunities for all Americans because the Republican-led Congress reformed taxes and rolled back burdensome regulations. I firmly believe wage issues should be addressed by states. I urge my colleagues to oppose this legislation, and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Florida. Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, it is just inexcusable that millions of people in the United States, one of the wealthiest nations on earth, work 40 hours or more every week and yet are unable to support themselves and their families. According to the Economic Policy Institute, 1 in 9 workers in the United States are paid wages that leave them in poverty even when working full-time and year-round. This clearly reflects the market failure that we must act to correct by guaranteeing hard-working Americans a fair wage. The lack of proper wage increases over the years has significantly contributed to the increase in poverty and income inequality. This issue is of great concern to me since my congressional district, Florida's 24, is one of the most economically depressed in the nation. And when coupled with the area's exorbitantly high cost of living, poverty and income inequality are further exacerbated. In 2016, Bloomberg ranked Miami as the U.S. city with the greatest income gap between rich and poor. Although Miami's income disparity is one of the most extreme to this day, it is a prime example of a serious problem that exists across the nation. There are 2 Miamis, a rich Miami and a struggling Miami. The growing income disparity threatens the very existence of our middle class and could dismantle the American dream of building wealth and financial stability. One straightforward way to resolve the issue of income inequality is simple: raise the minimum wage. And the bill we are discussing today, the Raise Wage Act, does just that. The Raise the Wage Act would gradually increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2024, putting more money into workers' pockets and, in turn, the nation's economy. For my constituents in Florida's 24th Congressional District, a raise in the minimum wage would benefit more than 164,000 people, nearly 50% of the workers in the district. The total wages for year-round affected workers would be increased by an average of $3,300 per year, a substantive 15% increase in their average annual earnings. A minimum wage increase would also provide a boost to people of color and women in particular, since more than half of all African-American women workers and nearly 60% of Latino employees earn less than $15 an hour, while women make up nearly 2/3 of all workers paid the minimum wage. Unquestionably, no one working full-time in America should be living in poverty. Raising the minimum wage is not only good for American workers, but it's also good for businesses and the economy overall, as it provides workers with more confidence and spending power. I strongly urge my colleagues to vote yes to raise hard-working Americans' wages. It gives them dignity. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Are there other comments? Gentlelady from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's unacceptable that an individual working 40 hours a week and earning the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour is living in poverty. The federal minimum wage has been stagnant for too long, exacerbating income inequality and leaving many working families in need of safety net services as they struggle to make ends meet while working full-time. More than 100 years ago, before the Fair Labor Standards Act was enacted, Oregon was one of the first states to pass a minimum wage law. But even today, a worker making the local minimum wage of $10.75 an hour in Washington County, Oregon, which is known as the economic engine of the state, would need to work 73 hours a week to afford a one-bedroom apartment. A recent study from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition found that a worker earning the federal minimum wage or prevailing state minimum wage cannot afford a two-bedroom rental home at fair market rent working 40 hours a week in any state, metropolitan area, or county in the country. A full-time worker earning the minimum wage should be able to afford basic needs like food, housing, transportation, and childcare to support their family. According to research from the National Employment Law Project, regardless of geographic location, by 2024, a single adult working full-time will need to earn $15 an hour just to cover basic living expenses. Congress must address the realities that workers face across the country. I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of Chairman Scott's Raise the Wage Act to gradually increase the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2024. The most recent increase to the federal minimum wage was in 2007, a dozen years ago, and it failed to address inflation rates. As a result, the gap between the median hourly wage and the minimum wage continues to grow, driving persistent income inequality. Importantly, the Raise the Wage Act would index the federal minimum wage to median wage growth. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, women and people of color are disproportionately affected by a low minimum wage. This committee has already demonstrated leadership in addressing wage gaps. Last week, we reported the Paycheck Fairness Act favorably to the floor. The Raise the Wage Act is another tool for addressing the gender wage gap. It's also important to note that workers who benefit from a gradual increase to a $15 minimum wage are often the primary breadwinner for their family. By gradually increasing the federal minimum wage floor to $15 an hour by 2024, the Raise the Wage Act will address persistent wage gaps, help reduce poverty rates, and support working families. Keep in mind that people making minimum wage are not holding on to the additional funds. They're spending those dollars in the local economy. I also want to point out that Oregon is one of only 7 states that prohibit employers from paying tipped workers a sub-minimum wage. Unfortunately, many states continue to allow a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, and as a result, their earnings are often unpredictable, making it difficult to budget and make stable financial plans for the future. The Raise the Wage Act includes important provisions to gradually phase out sub-minimum wages for tipped workers and clarify that workers have the right to retain the tips they receive. The bill would also gradually phase out sub-minimum wages for workers under 20 and workers with disabilities. Recent data from the Economic Policy Institute found that raising the federal minimum wage to $15 by 2024 would benefit 27,700 workers just in the Northwest Oregon district I'm honored to represent. Gradually raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2024 is good for workers and good for the economy. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment in nature of a substitute, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Are there other comments? Gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Chairman. This is America. You work hard, you play by the rules, you should be able to make it. I think everybody in this room agrees with that statement. But right now, working full-time, you're living in poverty if you're making minimum wage. This is the first time in over 11 years that we're even going to have a discussion or a vote on minimum wage. Over a decade. Finally, we're moving towards the finish line, and we need to get there. For the men and women who voted for us to come here, overwhelmingly, Americans approve of raising the minimum wage to the $15 an hour. Not just the 1%ers. I understand it. They want to keep them depressed. This is the people who sent us here. I worked for minimum wage. I was a single dad starting off my career. Minimum wage kept up today because when I started, it was $2.90. I would be making $18 an hour if it kept up with productivity, and certainly that's important. It was hard to make it back then. It is impossible today to live on minimum wage. People aren't surprised at that. What they are surprised is how people don't even come close to making it. Not even close. Thousands of hours short each month. And because they're making so little, they rely on government to make up for that. By raising the minimum wage, we teach, we give the opportunity for those people to have the dignity of a job that they can take care of their family. Right now, they're choosing between clothes, food, paying the bills. Our governor just signed a $15 an hour wage on the 31st of January, supported by business owners, low-wage workers from the shores to the city, To my friends here in Washington, it is time to wake up. But a couple facts, some true reality. I hear already that this is too big. The largest increase was 88% in 1 year. What happened? Unemployment went down by 2%, and the stock market went up by almost 18%. Exactly the opposite of what we're hearing. The gap between productivity and compensation over the course of the last 30 years went from fairly parallel in 73 to now there's a 129% gap. What does that say? It says the reality is they're keeping it at the top and not sharing it with those who help make the money. What does a minimum wage earner look like? 80% of them are over 20 years. I keep hearing, it's only a kid's wage. 79% have at least a high school diploma. 79%. So they do have skill sets, they have education. And 64% are women. 64%. This is the right thing to do. America believes it, your constituents believe it, but apparently the only people who don't believe it are those who don't look at the facts or only care about the 1%er. I urge the adoption of the substitute amendment, and I urge passage of this bill.
Will the gentleman yield? Will the gentleman yield? Thank you. And I just want to point out, we've heard the low number of people actually working at the $7.25 minimum wage. I'd point out that the reason so few actually work at the $7.25 minimum wage is that half the states have higher minimum wages than that, and it'd be illegal in those states to pay $7.25. Yield back. Gentleman, yield back.
Excellent point. 29 states are above it, remarkably. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other comments? Gentleman from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's just been interesting listening to my colleagues, and I need to confess, I don't understand the situation in Florida 24, in Miami, or Oregon 1 near Portland, or New Jersey 1 near Camden. You may have very good points, and I don't refute that at all. I would suggest, however, that perhaps you don't know the scenario in Salmon, Idaho, or Bonners Ferry. And that's where I struggle with the federal level making this decision, because the demographic is different, the cost of living is different, the employment opportunity is simply different. And I think you're probably very well warranted to pursue that policy for those areas. The problem is that it has a negative impact in some of the areas that I represent. So that, Mr. Chairman, is why I just respectfully submit that I think this decision belongs at the state level. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I move to strike the last word.
Ladies recognized for 5 minutes.
I'm glad that we're one step closer to raising the minimum wage for American workers, especially since it has not been raised since 2009. Workers are struggling to make ends meet, while the costs of housing, food, education, and childcare have all risen despite the stagnant wages. The reality is that there's not a community in this country where $7.25 an hour is an appropriate minimum wage. So I'm glad we're addressing this issue today. Though a $15 minimum wage would help workers, I believe that we need to be very mindful of how each community would be affected. Our country is made up of hundreds of microeconomies, but only one federal minimum wage across the board. The cost of everything from rent to a carton of milk to a haircut is different from one part of the United States to another. Everyone in this room knows this. Our minimum wage should account for those differences. $1 in Roswell, Georgia is different than $1 in San Francisco and New York City. We are all in agreement that the minimum wage needs to be raised to help American citizens. And I look forward to continuing to having these conversations with my colleagues on both sides. Yes, we should raise the minimum wage, but we should do it in a way that is mindful of every community, not just the large metropolitan centers. And I do look forward to passing this legislation out of committee today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you. Other comments? Gentleman from Northern Mariana Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Chairman Scott and members of the committee. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for introducing H.R. 582, and I am an original co-sponsor of the Raise the Wage Act. I know that eventually in today's markup there will be an amendment to the amendment in the nature of the substitute, but it has been 10 years since most American workers saw an increase in the minimum wage to $7.25 an hour. In the meantime, the real value of that wage has decreased to $6.19 an hour. So yes, it is high time to face the reality of what it really costs working people to support themselves and their families and to act. And it is time to link the federal minimum wage to the cost of living so that working people do not again see the value of their work erode over time as they wait for Congress to act. H.R. 582 achieves both those goals, a realistic minimum wage and an automatic adjustment tied to the real cost of living. I said that most American workers have seen no increase in 10 years because there is an exception. Workers in the Mariana Islands. Over the last 11 years in the Marianas, the federal minimum wage has doubled. The wage jumped from $3.05 an hour in 2007 to $7.25 an hour in September of last year. For those who are skeptical about the practicality of H.R. 582, which also doubles the minimum wage, I hold up the Marianas as an example. It can be done. It is possible. Our economy do not collapse. In fact, it grew. We have more Americans today in the workforce despite or maybe because of the increase in minimum wage. But having just doubled the minimum wage, I believe it is prudent, it is smart, it is wise to pause. And I thank my Democratic colleagues for recognizing this and including a special provision for the Marianas in this amendment in the nature of a substitute for H.R. 582. Having just absorbed a doubling of the minimum wage, this special provision allows the Marianas economy to take a breather for 18 months before the next increase kicks in. Again, this is prudent and a reasonable choice, but it in no way undermines the rationale for H.R. 582 to begin raising the minimum wage for the rest of America's minimum wage workers who, unlike workers in the Marianas, have seen no increase at all since 2009, if in terms of federal minimum wage. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Is the gentleman from Wisconsin seeking recognition?
Sure.
Gentleman's recognized.
I'm just going to ask to appeal to this committee's common sense. I know it's kind of dangerous territory to ask congressmen to use common sense, but you have to think yourself if you're a business owner and you raise minimum wage to this degree. If you're going up from paying somebody, I guess including workers' comp and Social Security taxes, probably you're paying about $16,000 a year now for some people. You're going to be knocking that up over $30,000 a year. If you were that businessman and you had to double the size of the check you write, what would you do? Okay, you're either going to force your people to work harder, you may decide to hire less people and automate more, you may cut back hours. But just like any other check you write in your life, you're going to find a way to make that up somewhere else. And I have a feeling what's going to happen is right now, you know, a lot of this, you can make fun of it, but a lot of it is younger people, maybe some of it is older people, And if, as an employer, you have to look at somebody, I once made minimum wages, I'm sure most of us in this room did. You're going to say, when I made minimum wage, it wasn't that difficult of a job. And if my employer had to pay twice that amount, may never have hired me. What you're going to have is you're going to have a lot less people working. And it's so important to get a beginning job so you can have a bigger job later. Not to mention there are some people out there who may not want the additional pressure that's going to be applied as the wages go up. But I will ask you to stop and think, what's going to happen to those employers and what decisions will those employers make? And obviously the decision by those employers will be to automate more, to hire less people, and to work the people that remain harder. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word. I want to thank the chairman for recognizing the urgent need to help everyday working Americans by prioritizing legislation in this committee to finally raise the federal minimum wage. I was thrilled that during the hearing this committee held several weeks ago, we had the opportunity to hear from a worker who had been directly impacted by a stagnant minimum wage, Mr. Terrence West. Terrence's story represents the stories of so many in this country who have to work multiple minimum wage jobs just to make a living wage. His testimony also speaks to an unfortunate fallacy that many of my colleagues still cling to, that work ethic has something to do with wealth and poverty. I agree with my colleague, Ms. Fox, that there's honor in all work, and it is well past time that our country begins to recognize that. However, this issue is of particular importance to me. I've seen firsthand what it looks like when families are struggling to make ends meet and the impact that that has on a young child's education. Many of my students from low-income families were forced to work while going to school in order to help their families pay bills. Roughly 1/5 of minimum wage workers are teenagers. And we need to recognize that many of them are not just doing this to earn extra money, to have spending money on the side, and that they too deserve a fair wage. Poverty comes at a high cost for young people. Far too many teenagers do not have a financially stable family to support them or fall back on. So by the time they reach that age, they're often left to fend for themselves or chip in to their family needs. Paying the bills and supporting one's family on a minimum wage salary often comes with sacrifices. For far too many young people, that sacrifice is giving up the dream of higher education. Eliminating young workers' ability to advance themselves through education only further entrenches generational poverty. Young people often fill the income gaps that exist in their families with their parents because the stagnant minimum wage has reduced buying power for low-income workers. Where they differ from their parents is that the federal subminimum wage for workers under 20 years is just $4.25 an hour. There is dignity in the hard work of young workers, and we need to start compensating them in a way that shows that. I am proud today to support the Raise the Wage Act, a bill that, in addition to raising the federal minimum wage, would phase out the youth subminimum wage that has allowed states and employers to take advantage of young people for far too long. Once again, I thank the chairman for his leadership on this important legislation and look forward to voting on its final passage on the House floor as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll yield back.
You, other comments? Gentleman from Virginia?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
And I'll be brief. This may be the first time in 11 years that we have debated raising the minimum wage here in Congress, but in Virginia, in the state legislature where I just finished serving, we debate it every year. Every year there is legislation to consider raising the minimum wage, and every year we debate it. We debate the economic impact, we debate where Virginia's economy is, and what a raise in the minimum wage would do to our economic success. And we're very proud of Virginia's economic success record. We're one of the top states in which to do business, one of the top states to raise a family. We want to keep it that way, so we keep firm tabs on how the economy's doing. But this bill, this amendment in the nature of a substitute, respectfully, would ensure that this is not just the first time in 11 years that we've considered raising minimum wage. It is the last time we will consider a bill to raise the minimum wage. And that's because this amendment in the nature of substitute indexes the wage after it achieves $15 to the median hourly wage of all employees. Not just the CPI, not just how the economy is doing, the median hourly wage of all employees. So it's not even based on economic performance. So what you have is a wage that may be artificially high in the face of severe economic downturns in one part of the country or another. You're going to have a wage that is just wreaking havoc across wide swaths of industry, being forced to lay off employees. If you have high unemployment in specific regions of the country, this is going to automatically trigger increases in the minimum wage, and employers are going to be hit hardest. Employees are going to be hit even harder than because they are going to be losing their jobs. So putting it on autopilot is not the right solution, and I would urge my colleagues to vote against the amendment in the nature of substitute.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I want to express my strong support for the ANS and for our push to finally, after so many years, increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour. This day is too long in coming. And there's no way that it should have taken almost 12 years since the U.S. Congress has approved the minimum wage increase. And never did I think, when I fought for the minimum wage to be increased in North Carolina, when I served in the General Assembly for 20 years, 13 years ago, and we only got a $1 increase there, that we'd be in this position today. The wage has only risen $1.10 since. Full-time workers earning the current federal minimum wage of $7.25 only earn about $14,500 a year in wages. Who in their right mind would think that that's enough to live on? None of us can live on that. How can a person earning $14,000 a year feed a family? But more than that, how can our economy grow when folks can't even afford basic necessities and luxuries? At $7.25 an hour, a person can't take their family out to eat. They can't buy something nice once in a while for their children. They can't take a break to see a movie. And for some reason, and for too long, we've been conditioned that this is okay, but it's not okay. We've been conditioned to think that only teenagers or college students earn the minimum wage, that there's no need to raise the wage because no one who works full-time is earning $7.25 an hour. That's not true. And so I challenge those folks who believe that to go back and to listen again to the testimony that we heard a few weeks ago from Mr. Wise, who spoke eloquently before this committee about his fight to provide for 3 daughters and a fiance while working at McDonald's, working 50 hours a week, but even after working 20 years in the fast food industry, which entitled him to a $2.40 raise, he still can't even afford a trip from Missouri to South Carolina to visit his mother. A prime example of how working hard isn't enough. If you don't make enough, working hard is just not enough. And I'm proud to stand with my colleagues and to tell the Terrence Wises of the world that we hear you. We hear your voice. We're sending the message today that if you work a full-time job, you should be entitled to a living wage. The Raise the Wage Act, which would raise the minimum wage to $15, and does so through a measured, gradual process. If you think about it, if you do your math, it's only $3 a year. We're talking about $15 by 2024. The bill would also eliminate the tip minimum wage, putting our service workers on an equal playing field, and also eliminating the opportunity for wage theft. And most important, the bill indexes the minimum wage to inflation. And that means that we won't have to be here 12 years from now fighting that same battle, trying to convince members of Congress that people need a raise. Mr. Chairman, enough is enough. Let's give our workers the dignity of a fair wage and pass H.R. 582 and end this farce once and for all. And I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of the Raise the Wage Act. The current federal minimum wage is not a livable wage. There is not one congressional district in the United States of America where a full-time worker making the current $7.25 per hour minimum wage can afford the essentials of life. Not one. In communities across this country, there are workers who are employed full-time and year-round, yet their wages are so low that they are living in poverty. The American people deserve better. By making the $15 minimum wage a reality, we will make sure that one full-time job guarantees the ability to live with dignity. One job should be enough in this country. I'm so pleased to work with you, Mr. Chairman, and with our colleagues to ensure that we gradually increase the federal minimum wage to $15 by 2024. No, we're not doubling the minimum wage overnight. This is common sense. We're doing it gradually over a 5-year period. As a longtime business owner, what we need is certainty and clarity in our regulations, and this delivers it. This bill will give roughly 40 million Americans a long overdue raise, and it's a good policy both for working people and our economy. And I just want to speak for a moment about Michigan's 9th District. 31% of the workers in my district will get a wage increase because of this bill. Specifically, 19% of prime age workers, 40 to 54 years old, will receive a raise. 38% of women will receive a raise. 45% of African American workers will receive a raise. 36% of Latinos. It's good policy and long overdue. I'm also pleased that this bill will ensure future increases to median wages keep pace with inflation. For too long, stagnant wages have allowed income inequality to fester, and this provision will help us tackle that enormous problem. And no, it doesn't mean we can never vote on this again. Congress can vote on this every year if they want to, change it any way we want. That's how democracy works. But it makes sense to index it to inflation so that workers have living wages going forward. I believe it's time, more broadly, to end trickle-down economics in this country and create a bottom-up economics that puts what's good for the average, hard-working American at the center of every policy decision. The undeniable reality is that raising the minimum wage will create better jobs and boost the standard of living for workers and entire families. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. Mr. Chairman, I congratulate you on your leadership on this, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other comments? Gentleman from New York, Mr. Morale.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I was not originally intending to, first of all, I move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I wasn't inclined to speak on this, but given the discussion, I wanted to make a few observations on how I come to my position on this bill and my support for this bill, which I very much appreciate your leadership on, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I take the position, I'm a supporter of a market economy. And I think the market economy is provided innovation in this country. I think it has lent entrepreneurship and has made great strides. But any economic system has flaws. And any economic system creates disparities in the distribution of resources and wealth. We know that to be true. And the minimum wage is, in fact, one of the adjustments as a matter of public policy that we make to smooth out those disparities. And I've heard comments that essentially this is a decision best left to the states. I served for a number of years, as I've indicated, in the New York State Assembly. New York has a $15 minimum wage. So I agree states can lift the wage above the federal wage, which I see as a floor, not a ceiling. But so the federal minimum wage does have a place. I think that was not only asserted for the first time by President Roosevelt in the Congress in 1938, but every subsequent president and every subsequent Congress has affirmed the federal right to establish a minimum wage. And I took note of the fact that in 1976, when I was working to put myself through college at Temple Brith Kodesh, they were kind enough recently to send me my one of my pay stubs that they had found in the archives, and I made $2.30, which I'm not sure I was worth, but that was the minimum wage in 1976. If you, without making any adjustments for productivity, but simply looked at what the wage would be, it would be $10.76 today when simply adjusting for inflation. So this is essentially about maintaining purchasing power. I do also note that in an economy where you have essentially a labor shortage and are paying people, to the argument that's been made here today, more than the minimum wage, I would argue that's exactly the time to raise the minimum wage because it'll have less of an impact, disruptive impact, on the businesses that are already exceeding the minimum wage by a significant degree in their efforts to attract what is a scant labor market and scant labor supply. So I think this is entirely appropriate. I also think that the best feature of this bill, if I might, is my belief in having an adjustment made so that the purchasing power continues along without an erosion of a person's ability making the minimum wage to see the effective purchasing power of that wage decline with no additional action by the government. It's long overdue in my view. This is appropriate for all Americans. I think it helps, again, ensure that in a market economy, which we have in the United States, that those are the proper adjustments to make to ensure that those disparities or those unfairnesses, inequalities that arise from any economic system are appropriately dealt with. So I am in support of this legislation. I think it is high time to do it. Let's keep pace with inflation. Let's maintain purchasing power. Let's make sure that the hardest working Americans who are either entering the job market or piecing together several minimum wage jobs have a more livable situation. With that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Shalala.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this committee markup on such an important piece of legislation. We're supposed to be a land of opportunity where hard work is rewarded, but today's minimum wage is not enough for a family to make ends meet. 1 in 9 U.S. workers are paid wages that leave them in poverty, even when working full-time and year-round. Gradually, and I emphasize the word gradually, raising the minimum wage by $15 by 2024 provides hardworking Americans with income to spend on the basics that they need. This in turn generates business for our economy and eases the burden on taxpayer-funded services. It's a win-win. This is literally a game changer for my district, the 27th District of Florida. Miami is a great city. For so many reasons, but in fighting economic inequality, as my Florida colleague has indicated, we have so much work to do. 62.7% of Miami families spend more than 30% of their income on rent. A report last year by the National Low Income Housing Coalition showed that a tenant must earn $25, almost $26 an hour or more than $54,000 per year just to pay the average rent in Miami of $1,350 per month. Whether in Miami or anywhere else in this great nation, a full-time worker making the minimum wage should be able to afford the basic essentials. I'm proud to support the Minimum Wage Act and to fight for 143,000 constituents who will be positively impacted by the passage of this bill. Let me repeat that. Over 37% of the workers in my district will be positively affected by the passage of this bill. It simply strengthens the American dream. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. Other people wishing to speak? Gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to speak in support of the Raise the Wage Act, of which I am a proud co-sponsor. With the federal minimum wage having stagnated for over 10 years, this legislation is needed now more than ever. Each year that goes by and inflation continues to increase, the federal government continues to fail to keep pace with reality, the reality that regular working families face when they work multiple jobs and still can't afford the basic costs of living. And we all know that women and minorities fare worst in this equation. Research has shown that a $15 wage floor would make a real difference in closing the pay gaps that still exist in this country. Today, I urge my colleagues to take care of the unfinished business of the women's rights and civil rights movements and pass this legislation. I also hear some of my colleagues' concerns with raising the federal minimum wage, and I look forward to working with you and continue to be in touch with our small businesses back in Michigan's 11th District and franchises to ensure that the Raise the Wage Act is implemented in a way that works for employers of all sizes. My home state of Michigan is one of 20 states that will see an increase in the minimum wage this year, and rightfully so. The value of the minimum wage has decreased over the past 10 years, and in fact, today's minimum wage workers earn approximately $2 an hour less adjusted for inflation than their counterparts did over 50 years ago, despite being significantly more productive. So long as the federal minimum wage exists, we cannot rely on elusive market forces to drive wages up, because that has not happened. The federal government must set an example of what a livable wage means in today's economy and pass the Raise the Wage Act. This legislation is long overdue and will allow the government to take a giant and long step forward to keep in line with the real costs of living and the true value of work and productivity in this country. Thank you, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentlelady from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last week, this committee approved two critical bills, the Rebuild America's School Act and the Paycheck Fairness Act. These were about lifting people up, children who are trapped in crumbling schools and women who are denied the equal pay they've earned. Today, we aim to lift up nearly 2 million Americans who are paid the minimum wage or less. The standard federal minimum wage has been stuck at $7.25 an hour for 10 years. Unless we act soon, this will be the longest stretch without an increase in its 80-year history. There is no dignity of work when we don't pay workers a wage that they can live on. And it is indecent for hardworking people to put in 40 or more hours a week, yet not achieve a good standard of living. There are far too many families, like the one I grew up in, who are living paycheck to paycheck. My father and mother worked long hours at tough jobs. He was a union iron worker, and she juggled multiple minimum wage jobs. But thanks to their hard work and their long hours, they were able to give my sisters and me a good home and an opportunity to create our own futures. We are failing to do the same for working people today. The average cost to put an infant in a licensed child care center is $1,230 a month. How much does a minimum wage worker earn working full-time in a month? Less than $1,200. In only 22 counties out of more than 3,000 counties nationwide, can a full-time minimum wage worker afford a one-bedroom rental home? Since when did it become okay for full-time workers to be unable to afford a family or even just a decent place to live? These basic things should not be out of reach for so many hardworking people. Nearly a third of working moms and nearly half of working single mothers will get a raise if we pass the Raise the Wage Act. If you're working full-time for the federal minimum and you have two children, then you're earning less than $15,000, about $5,000 below the poverty level. Passing this bill will help these hardworking moms make ends meet. We can do better than the status quo. In the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we are doing better. Our Republican governor and Democratic legislature have already approved legislation to increase the minimum wage to $15 per hour by 2023. The Raise the Wage Act will level the playing field by lifting these workers up rather than encouraging a race to the bottom. I'm afraid that for too many people in this country, progress has stalled. And while the Raise the Wage Act isn't a cure-all, it's an excellent first step and one that we should absolutely take. I thank the chairman for your leadership, and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. Other comments? Hearing none, we will now get to the amendments insofar as there appear to be no amendments offered in advance for the roster. The other amendments are now in order that will not get the same informed response that we could have had if they'd been appointed, if they had been offered for the roster. Does any member have an amendment? Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr.
Mr.
Chairman. I have an
Chairman.
amendment at the desk.
Just a minute. Gentlelady from Oregon.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Gentleman from Virginia will hesitate for just a minute as the amendment is being distributed. Gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment goes to the point I was making in my last remarks. It would state that no prospective increase in the minimum wage mandated by the bill would take effect if monthly unemployment growth is negative for at least 3 months in the year prior to a wage hike taking effect. The unemployment rate increased by 0.25 percentage points from the prior month in any of the 12 months prior to a scheduled increase, or the national unemployment rate is above 6% for any month during the prior 12 months. Mr. Chairman, both sides want to see Americans succeed, and that includes being able to support themselves financially, but the claim that this unprecedented 107% hike in the federal minimum wage would help working people have it backwards. This bill would do nothing to help workers, but in fact would be catastrophic to workers, their employers, and the U.S. economy. A recent study from NFIB projects that raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour would result in a $2 trillion reduction in real economic output, a $980 billion reduction in real GDP, a $103 billion reduction in personal disposable income, 1.6 million jobs lost, and 615,000 able-bodied individuals no longer in the workforce, all by the year 2029, a mere 10 years away. This amendment puts in place a much-needed safety net if this bill doesn't do what it claims to do. Passing a bill that will have such a crippling negative impact on its citizens without a provision like my amendment leaves citizens vulnerable to the full destructive impact of this bill on them, their communities, and the economy. I urge both sides of the aisle to support the amendment.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The fact-based evidence clearly demonstrates that increasing the minimum wage causes little to no job loss. The most comprehensive recent study evaluated 138 state-level minimum wage increases and found no evidence that a higher minimum wage led to reductions in employment. An analysis of 70 studies on the impact of the minimum wage on employment found that negative impacts on employment from increases to the minimum wage were, quote, too small to be statistically detectable. Recent projections of the impacts of $15 an hour by 2024 in Mississippi estimate a net gain in employment of approximately 2,000 jobs by 2024. This would be equal to 0.1% of total employment in Mississippi. And that's because when workers have more money in their pockets, they spend it. For households with minimum wage workers, researchers have found that after a minimum wage increase, spending increased by roughly $700 per quarter. In short, increased spending equals increased jobs. Most importantly, evidence from the states that are already on their way to $15 an hour demonstrates that workers are better off, there has been no job loss, and the economies in those states are fine. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady's time has expired. Are there other comments? Chair recognizes himself to make for 5 minutes. I'll just very briefly say that this amendment presumes that there is job loss with the minimum wage, and as the gentlelady from Pennsylvania has indicated, the increase in the minimum wage actually has a stimulative effect. So if we have a downturn, minimum wage could actually be helpful in stimulating the economy. The workers shouldn't have to wait for the economy to turn around before they get a very much needed minimum wage, as their wages are deteriorating with inflation, and employers need to be able to predict when the next minimum wage increase would take place. With this amendment, that would make such predictions problematic. For those reasons, I would hope that we would defeat the amendment. The other comments? If not, the questions on the amendment. All in favor of the, excuse me, the gentlelady withdraw her point of order?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my point of order.
The question is now on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. No. Noes appear to have it. Gentleman from Virginia.
I'd ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested and will be rolled into the end. Next amendment, gentleman from Pennsylvania, do you have an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Does clerk will report the amendment?
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 582 offered by Mr. Muser.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania. Wait, excuse me, gentlelady from Oregon, did you reserve a point of order?
Reserve a point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Point of order is reserved. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This unprecedented and extreme one-size-fits-all mandate proposed in the underlying bill would force many job creators, as research has shown, to reduce workers' hours, let employees go, or close their doors for good. These impacts would be felt most strongly by small businesses. This amendment exempts small business from the underlying bill. According to a recent National Federation of Independent Businesses study, the NFIB, this legislation would cost the U.S. economy 1.6 million jobs over the next 10 years. Of the 1.6 million jobs this legislation will eliminate, 57% come from small businesses. Small businesses' optimism remains above historical averages. If we want to allow Main Street to thrive, significantly increasing the cost of doing business is not the way to do it. This amendment recognizes the damage such a command and control bill, which ignores free markets, states' rights, historical data, and everyday Main Street feedback will cause by exempting the smallest businesses from this 107% minimum wage increase, and I urge my colleagues to support it.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back.
You said, gentlelady from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to speak in opposition to this amendment as the daughter of a small business owner who worked in small businesses for years. If there's one thing small businesses need, it's more customers with more money in their pockets. And researchers have found that when the minimum wage is increased, households with minimum wage workers increase their spending. A 2016 report found that a 10% increase in the minimum wage would generate $2 billion of additional demand in the economy each year. Additionally, Kathy Eckhouse, the owner of La Quercia, who testified before this committee, said that paying higher wages helps reduce turnover by providing a more livable wage and increasing employee loyalty. And of course, employee turnover is considerable cost to small businesses. So there's no reason to adopt this amendment. Everyone should be able to earn minimum wage with which they can pay their bills, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Other comments? Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment is one of these things that sounds good, but is really an illusion. I owned a software development company for more than a decade, which had, I think, the highest employment. We had 12 people working in a small operation. So I would be right in the person that would be defined my company. But the truth is that if you own a small business and you're competing for employees, the notion that a competitor that might have more than 10 employees is paying essentially double the wage that you would pay, the truth is you have no protections under this because you're going to be required, if you're going to compete in that marketplace for those workers, you're going to have to pay the minimum wage or more. So this is one of these, it's a feel-good thing, I understand it. The truth is that for many small businesses, the big struggle is to retain workers, because there's a fair amount of training that will go in depending on what the job is. But I know in my case, if I had to invest in significant turnover because there were larger businesses that would pay a significantly higher wage, it means high turnover for me. It means adding to a relatively small workforce a significantly higher percentage of dollars into training and attracting new workers. So the reality is this could not work. Smaller employees would not be, particularly in an environment where you're struggling to find workers, as was mentioned by my colleagues earlier. This is a difficult labor market if you're an employer, because it's hard in many cases to find workers. So if you're struggling to do that, the notion that you'd be paying 50% less for workers on an hourly basis than larger competitors, and maybe only slightly larger competitors, is simply just not a reality. So I would urge against this amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other comments? Gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to add to the words my colleague just mentioned. We actually in Seattle learned the hard way. We tried to have a different scale for small businesses initially than we did for large businesses. And what actually happened is that exactly what Mr. Morelli said, that those small businesses were competing for the same workers. And so it didn't make sense for those small businesses to have this longer period of time because the market forces drove them towards the same wages. And so in the end, everybody ended up at the same wage much more quickly than the timeline that we had laid out. And so I would oppose this amendment for the same reasons. And Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to take this opportunity to say how important this bill is and how important your leadership has been in making sure that we raise the pay of nearly 40 million workers in the United States. Really 10 years since minimum wage workers have gotten a raise in this country. And just to draw a finer point to the Seattle experience, because I was on the committee that wrote that proposal that eventually ended up being the legislation that passed our city council in 2014, we spent months listening to workers, to business owners talk to us about the potential consequences and effects. The Restaurant Association brought a lot of restaurant owners to us. We listened to all of them. Some of them talked about how it would force them to close down their restaurants. We heard from some big businesses who said, you know, the economy is going to crash. Really, many of the same arguments, Mr. Chairman, that we heard decades ago when Washington State became one of the few states in the country to tie our minimum wage, index it to inflation. Well, I'll also say that there were many responsible small businesses and some big businesses, high road employers, who came to testify to us about some other critical pieces of why raising the minimum wage was good for the economy and good for their business. And they talked about it really in terms of what happens when you raise the wages of low-wage workers. They plow that money back into the economy. So when workers do better, particularly those at the lowest end of the spectrum, businesses do better. When businesses do better, the economy does better. And it's sort of a circular good for everybody piece. And so I just wanted to say that between 2017 and 2018, this is actually what happened after we passed the legislation. Nearly 500 new restaurants opened in Seattle. The industry has been so successful that restaurant owners are now scrambling to fill positions, not exactly the narrative that we heard in opposition. And many of the very same restaurateurs that came and testified to us that it would hurt their businesses are actually the same ones that opened new restaurants. And Seattle's economy in general has continued to grow leaps and bounds, with unemployment now at 3% compared to the national average of 4%, and job growth now forecasted above the national average by 1.5%. So what about the workers? What about the minimum wage workers that got to see a raise? Raising the minimum wage put more money in their pockets. So according to researchers at the University of Washington, who tracked low-wage workers over 18 months, some workers saw increases of $251 per quarter, which is a fortune for people at the bottom end of the scale. Not enough, but still significant. Turnover, as Mr. Morelli said, decreased by 8% because people could actually afford to live with those jobs that they had. And a case study that was published in 2012 showed that turnover an employee costs about 20% of that employee's salary, meaning that turnover is always bad for business. So trends that increase wages and decrease turnover are generally good. They're good for business owners, they're good for workers, and they're good for the economy. And I think around the country, we're starting to see an increasing number of business owners and organizations, from the American Sustainable Business Council to the Patriotic Millionaires to several chambers of commerce, supporting increasing the minimum wage because they believe that helping workers helps Main Street. A 2016 report found that increasing the minimum wage by 10% would increase national sales by $2 billion a year. Increases in income, again, as I said, reinvested in local economies, whether it's people going out to eat more frequently or just making the important purchases that those families have had to put off. And so I just want to say, Mr. Chairman, that this bill is so important across the country. It is important in my district. 6,800 workers would see their wages go up in cities that have not passed a $15 minimum wage, because I do cover other smaller cities. And I just want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, again for bringing this forward and express my strong support for the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The other comments, gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, this discussion is very interesting this morning, and I would point out to my colleagues that are in support of this legislation, if you really believe this, if you really think that increasing the minimum wage is going to grow the economy, if you really think it's good, unemployment won't change, and you're just going to increase incomes, why don't you have a minimum wage at $100 an hour, right? Why not have it at $100 an hour? Why not do it immediately? Why do it gradually?
Is the gentleman offering an amendment?
I'm not, but I think that this is, the way that this is structured, that you're gradually increasing it, is an acknowledgement on your part. The legislation in front of us acknowledges that this is dislocative. You're changing the economy, and not in a good way. And so if you think it's really good, do it now. Do it $100. Why are you holding back? And I know why you're holding back. What the legislation tells me you're holding back is you're saying, I don't want to do $100. I'm going to go to $15. I'm going to do it over time. And because you're doing it over time, that in turn is saying to all of us that are voting on this that we're not sure of what we're really saying.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
Thank you. I would just say that any major piece of legislation, I think, does happen in steps. And we are recognizing, of course, that people need to have some time to take care of planning for it. That's the thing we heard the most from business owners. It wasn't really about increasing the wage. You know, first of all, you just have to talk about what is possible in this time. But really what they said to us is just tell us what it's going to look like, and then we'll plan for it. And so I would just say that I appreciate the gentleman's arguments, but they're not rooted in the facts of how we actually make change in this country. And I would return it by asking the gentleman, if you really believe it's possible for people to live on a subhuman, sub-minimum tipped wage, if you really believe it's possible for families across the country to live on $7.25 in perpetuity, do you not feel the responsibility to help people have one job that puts a roof over their head and food on the table and take care of their families? I think that's the American dream. Thank you, thank you for yielding.
Sure. Well, just thank you for returning the floor. Again, I would reiterate, if you really think that a high minimum wage is good for the economy, if no unemployment will go away, why are you stopping here? Why not go all the way? Why not go to $100? Why not go to $500? Why stop here? If you really think what you're saying is true, I think this bill would be extremely different. I yield to my colleague from New York, Mr. Morelli.
Yeah, I thank you for that, and I appreciate the give and take. But I think then the question would be, logically, given your comments, would you have no minimum wage at all? I think what this is simply a recognition of, as I indicated earlier, from my perspective, that given that in 1938 and every subsequent president on both sides of the aisle and Congress has since then have continued to support the minimum wage and increases since that time, that this is an acknowledgement that the minimum wage, when it was originally started in the 30s, is appropriate public policy in a market economy, and that to make sure there's no erosion of the purchasing power, there have been adjustments made. The fact is, it's been a decade since the last adjustment. It's high time to do it. And I think, actually, as I indicated earlier, I think the fact that we would adjust for inflation or an index to median income growth actually makes great sense. It would probably mean that we wouldn't have to have this debate in the future, and everyone who works at the minimum wage would see a modest adjustment that keeps essentially at pace with inflation.
Thank you. Well, I'll just, my first job was less than minimum wage. I was working in a kitchen in, the food service business, like I think many of us did. And but to me, that is the first rung in the ladder of opportunity for the American dream. Let's get in that first rung. And so if you're making that rung higher and harder to get to, fewer people will be able to get to it. And that's what I'm concerned about. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Are there other comments? If not, the chair recognizes himself very briefly just to say the research has shown that the gradual increases and a predictable increase and a reasonable increase has all been shown to benefit the workers and not adversely affect employment. The reasonableness is percentage of the minimum of the median wage. If you increase productivity or adjust the minimum wage in the past for inflation, those are some of the measures that have been used in the past. And I'd say just on this particular amendment that this committee has had problems with joint employment, and this amendment would just incentivize people from incorporating, supplying workers 9 at a time so that they wouldn't be subject to the minimum wage. And I think that we're having trouble enough with the joint employment issue that we should not adopt this amendment. Are there further comments? If not, the questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my point of order.
Thank you. Point of order is withdrawn. Question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. All in favor will say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Noes appear to have it.
You request a recorded vote?
The recorded vote is requested and will be rolled to the end. Are there other amendments? Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 582, offered by Mr. Allen.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentlelady from Oregon.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Gentleman from Georgia.
This amendment seeks to ensure that the minimum wage increases in the underlying bill will not go into effect if there are a significant number of unemployed young workers. In a recent survey, 84% of economists agree that raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour would have a negative impact on youth employment. The radical $15 minimum wage rate included in this bill would create an insurmountable barrier to entry for young workers who generally have fewer skills and less experience. Almost half of workers paid at or below minimum wage are under the age of 25. These are young people at the start of their careers or working in part-time or summer jobs. I believe that our first jobs are critical to learning invaluable job skills. Raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour puts these critical jobs at risk of being eliminated altogether. Minimum wage employees are not typically heads of households. They are most often single teenagers in their first job or individuals gaining supplemental income. Millions of entry-level workers have learned personal responsibility, teamwork, conflict resolution, discipline, and accountability throughout the jobs that this bill is putting in jeopardy. H.R. 582 would hurt the very people it is trying to help. It will significantly limit the entry-level opportunities businesses are able to create, and as a result, people with limited skills or experience looking to enter the workforce will be harmed the most. This amendment will ensure that the radical minimum wage hikes mandated by this bill do not occur if they will harm our younger workers, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Florida.
I move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Ladies recognized.
I strongly oppose this amendment. Young workers performing the same work should not be paid less simply because of their age. While the average minimum wage worker impacted by the Raise the Wage Act is 36 years old, teen workers who make the minimum wage also deserve a fair wage. Mr. Chairman, I know these young workers. Who are they? They are not working just to supplement their income. Many of them are teenage workers who are, in fact, working to supplement their family's income, and thousands of them, over 70% of the college students in this country, are working to help pay their way through college, as well as supporting their families. I know these young people. In 3 universities which I have headed, the large majority of students were working, and a very high percentage of them were already married and supporting their families. They weren't working 1 job, they were working 2 and 3 jobs in some cases, and trying to get through school. 28,000 of them live in my district, and I argue for them because I know their faces, I know how hard they're working. It is a myth to think that we have a bunch of young people working in this country simply to buy extra things for themselves. That is no longer true in this country. The cost of higher education, the cost of supporting their families requires that they literally go to school and go to work. And therefore, I oppose this amendment, and I strongly urge my colleagues to disapprove it.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentlelady from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to address and oppose this amendment specifically as it applies to the subminimum wage for tipped workers. The current $2.13 subminimum wage for tipped workers was set in 1991, which is unacceptable. As we heard from Vanita Gupta from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights during the legislative hearing on this bill, the origins of the tipped subminimum wage are deeply intertwined with the history of slavery in this country. Tipped workers are generally low-wage workers. Their earnings are often irregular and unpredictable. Oregon is one of only 7 states that prohibit employers from paying tipped workers a subminimum wage. Research demonstrates that workers in the 7 states that have eliminated the subminimum tipped wage continue to receive tips from customers and businesses, and they have not suffered economic hardship, as my colleague from Washington just discussed. Tipped workers in the 7 states that have eliminated the tipped subminimum wage see more take-home pay. They earn more per hour than workers receiving the $2.13 as a cash wage. Poverty rates for tipped workers in equal treatment states like Oregon are lower than those for tipped workers with a $2.13 tipped minimum wage. The current system in states that uses subminimum wage for tipped workers is not working. A compliance assessment by the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division of nearly 9,000 full-service restaurants from 2010 to 2012 found that more than 83% of investigated restaurants had some type of wage compliance violation. The Trump administration's recent rollback of protections for tip workers will expose even more workers to the problematic 2-tier system that lacks enforcement, allowing employers to pay more tipped employees a subminimum wage. It's important, Mr. Chairman, that the Raise the Wage Act includes a provision to gradually phase out subminimum wages for tip workers and to clarify that all workers have the right to retain any tips they receive. I urge opposition to this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there other comments? Chair recognizes himself to very briefly make a comment. As I understand the amendment, no one gets a minimum wage increase if the youth unemployment rate is above the requisite number. People shouldn't have to wait for minimum wage generally because the youth unemployment is high. If the youth unemployment gets above the requisite number, no business could predict when the new minimum wage would kick in, and that violates the principle of making sure these minimum wage increases are in fact predictable. I yield back. Are there other comments? If not, gentlelady from Oregon.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw the point of order.
Point of order is withdrawn. The question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. Noes appear to have it. Noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Gentleman requests a recorded vote. That will be rolled until the end. The next amendment, gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 582, offered by Mr. Smucker.
Gentlelady from Oregon.
I reserve a point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Point of order is reserved. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been noted earlier in our discussion that there are 29 states, as well as the District of Columbia, who have implemented their own minimum wages that are higher than the federal standard. And this is true as well for dozens of cities and counties, which demonstrates the flexibility of the federal law. Now, we've had disagreement about where these decisions should be made. I happen to agree with those who believe that these decisions are best made at the state level and the local level rather than here. But we should all be able to agree that union members should not be left out in the cold, and standards of minimum wage should apply to unionized workers as well as non-unionized. So this amendment simply prohibits any state or locality from adopting a law establishing a minimum wage that exempts the required payment of the wage to an employee covered by a collective bargaining agreement. Why is this important? Because in recent years, multiple localities have passed minimum wage laws which exempted workers covered by a collective bargaining agreement. There was a Los Angeles Times article from 2016 titled "Outrage After Big Labor Crafts Law Paying Their Members Less Than Non-Union Workers." And it specifically lists California cities, including San Francisco, San Jose, Oakland, and Santa Monica, that have included such language in their minimum wage ordinances. One worker who was interviewed for the article noted that he was paying dues but earning less than in a non-union workplace. The article also describes how the exemptions are designed to drive up union membership and revenue from dues at the expense of workers. The head of the local hotel workers union, who was lobbied for this labor loophole, acknowledged that it will perhaps cause employers to be less resistant to unionization. Even some union leaders refused to support the practice, and one was quoted in the article, said, "I just think unions should not be in the business of carving out lower wage standards for ourselves. We don't help ourselves with anybody, with our members, or with the public by defending the indefensible." The LA Times editorial board called it hypocrisy, and this is a quote, "hypocrisy at its worst," and it plays into the view that labor is more interested in unionizing companies and boosting its roles of dues-paying members than in helping poor workers. So again, no city should be in the business of leaving union members out in the cold in an attempt to boost organizing efforts. This amendment ensures fairness for union workers, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, first of all, I'd like to reserve a point of order.
Point of order has been already reserved.
Oh, it has, okay,
And it
good.
is actually too late to reserve another point of order.
Okay. All right, well, then I'd just like to speak against this, so-called Union Fairness Amendment. The so-called Fairness for Union Workers Amendment would block any state and any local government from enacting their own minimum wage laws if any single employer, public or private, had a collective bargaining agreement which exempts the covered workers from compliance with the minimum wage in such state or local area. We should not be wiping out entire state laws merely because the laws provide flexibility for negotiated wages that are above the minimum wage floor set at the federal level. This bill is about assuring a fair minimum wage nationally. Arguably, if such a collective bargaining agreement exists that have wages below a state or local minimum, these can only exist if there's a state or local law permitting such an exemption, which is an arm's length agreement. Moreover, it would only be permissible provided that the workers were not paid less than the federal minimum wage. If such agreements were permissible because, for example, there was a trade-off of wages for pensions or health benefits, and such trade-offs did not fall below the federal minimum wage, that's within the purview of state and local governments. There is no role for Congress in preempting such laws. Mr. Chairman, I I wore my special Ralph Falsanella tie today, which commemorates the Lawrence strike of 1912. I appreciate the gentleman's sudden concern for the welfare of union workers, and I look forward to working with the gentleman to help more workers form unions and bargain collectively in this country. Union workers across the economy make more than non-union workers, and whenever these agreements exist, they almost uniformly exist because those workers with voice and power in their workplace are negotiating for pensions and health care agreements, the kind of things that created the middle class of this country. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The other comments? Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Norcross.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, this is an area that I spent a little bit of time on, and it's the reality of what goes on when you get a group of employees that band together to form unions. And I got to tell you, I was just gone for a few minutes, and I come back, and I think we have a new group of Republicans who care about unions, which I really enjoy because they're your members, they're the ones who vote for you, so I really appreciate it. But I just wanted to expound on one issue when we start talking about this amendment. Collective bargaining agreement comes together, and as we all know, there's a cost to the employer per hour of those employees. Most people think of it, it's just wages. I know most of the people in this room understand there's taxes, and in many cases, that's it. But those with collective bargaining agreements, health plans, pension plans, annuities, retirement funds, education funds, and they all make a choice. The employees make a choice in conjunction with that employer where they want to apply the money. Now, they always keep up with the minimum wage. Most times they far exceed that. But this, using this as a benchmark, completely irrelevant to what is going on. If they comply with it, that's the law. Trying to go in backwards or the backdoor approach to eliminate those collective bargaining agreements through state law is disingenuous. But I stand here ready to work with my colleagues the other side because I think there really is middle ground. I don't think anybody in this room believes you can make it on $7.25 an hour. It will be 17 years, if this were to pass right away, 17 years to phase in $7, predictably, which levels the playing field. All we hear is we need predictability, and what you've had for the last 10 years with no increase is no predictability. It's a patchwork. This has worked since the 1950s, and it has worked well. And the people who elected you, go home and ask them if they believe in minimum wage, because I've seen the polling from around the country. There's not a state that I've seen that is against this, up close to 90%. This is about fairness. Nobody's getting rich. They're not buying their yacht. They don't have their house in the Bahamas. These are people who want the dignity of work. And I urge a no vote on this amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman's time expired. The other comments? If not, gentlelady from Oregon.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, pursuant to Rule 16 of the Rules of the House of Representatives, the amendment is not germane for 3 reasons. First, it fails the subject matter test for germaneness because the underlying bill does not reference collective bargaining agreements. Second, it fails the germaneness test of class because the underlying bill addresses a federal minimum wage and the amendment addresses the ability of states and municipalities to establish minimum wage laws. Third and finally, it fails the condition test for germaneness because the condition relating to collective bargaining is not germane to the underlying proposition of the bill that is under consideration, namely to establish a federal minimum wage.
Chair is prepared to rule. Gentleman from Pennsylvania on the point of order.
Mr. Chairman, I consulted with the House parliamentarian when drafting this amendment to ensure that it was drafted to be germane to the amendment in the nature of a substitute we are considering. This amendment meets all of the tests of germaneness, including subject matter and fundamental purpose, minimum wage protections. Mr. Chairman, at the committee's last markup, 2 legitimate germane amendments that the minority had sought the advice of the House parliamentarian on were ruled non-germane. While I can appreciate that members of the committee will disagree on policy issues, we must all agree to follow the rules and precedents of the House. As this amendment is germane, I ask that the chair rule against the point of order and allow full consideration of this amendment. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair is prepared to rule. The amendment was unfortunately not on the roster, and therefore you're not going to get a very well-reasoned ruling on the point of order, which could have taken place, and we could have consulted with the parliamentarian just to make sure. But in any case, we'll overrule the point of order in the next questions on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will vote aye.
Aye.
All opposed, vote no. No. Noes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, I respectfully appeal the ruling of the chair.
Oh, okay. You can repeal the ruling of the chair.
I asked for a recorded vote. I'm sorry.
Recorded vote is requested.
These are mine.
The ruling was that the amendment was germane. The gentleman, I think, has withdrawn his appeal of the ruling of the chair. And the question is now, and the question that we're voting on is on the amendment. The chair has ruled that the amendment was defeated on the voice vote, and a recorded vote is requested.
Yes.
Recorded vote will be rolled. Gentlelady from North Carolina, do you have an amendment?
Yes, sir. Thank you, and thank you for that ruling. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chair, I reserve a point of order.
First, the clerk will report the amendment offered by the gentlelady from North Carolina.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 582, offered by Ms. Fox.
And who sought recognition? Ms. Adams?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment strikes the provision in the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute which delays the effective date of H.R. 582 by 18 months for the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. The chairman just pointed out that he would have liked to have had the amendment that was just offered earlier. We need to talk about the fact that this provision was in the amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was not included in H.R. 582 originally, and was not debated in the hearing. It is a surprise to us to come up. I want to say I have concerns about how this amendment ended up in the amendment in the nature of a substitute at the 11th hour. H.R. 582, as introduced, made no mention of the Marianas or of a compliance delay. During our one hearing on this bill, not one member and none of the witnesses referred to the islands or any provision calling for a delay. To include this carve-out in a last-minute Democrat amendment is inappropriate. I believe the committee needs more information and more deliberation of this issue before this provision is considered. I note that the chairman's mark also includes a GAO study on the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands economy and the effects that H.R. 582 would have on workers in the Northern Mariana Islands. Perhaps the committee should receive this report before deciding on the best course of action for the Marianas. The delay provision also raises another point. Even under H.R. 582, minimum wage increases in the Northern Mariana Islands would go up much more slowly than in the states because of separate legislation signed into law in 2007 and amended in 2015. For many years, the Northern Mariana Islands were allowed to have a lower minimum wage than the general federal standard due to its overall lower wages when compared to the United States. This may well have been appropriate at the time, But if the federal minimum wage for the Northern Mariana Islands was not appropriate, and is not appropriate now, according to the chairman's mark, then the committee should also consider whether a $15 minimum wage is appropriate for the many regions of the country with a lower cost of living. The median wage and the cost of living is much higher in New York City, San Francisco, and Seattle than it is in many other regions of the country. Even in those large cities, a $15 minimum wage has caused job losses and business closings. I'm very concerned about what a $15 minimum wage would do to jobs and opportunity in other regions around the country, in addition to the Northern Mariana Islands. Furthermore, Mr. Chairman, I was listening closely when the amendment, the nature of a substitute, has been discussed. Mr. Sablon pointed out how wonderful it was that the wage has doubled in the Northern Mariana Islands in the last 10 years from $3.55 to $7.25. I think that's pretty pitiful. I also point out that there are people here who have talked about teenagers. What about the teenagers in the Northern Marianas who are being discriminated against? For all of these reasons, Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support the amendment so we can more carefully consider the federal minimum wage as it applies to the Northern Mariana Islands. And I also hope we could remember the parts of the country that would face similar peril if a 107% increase in the federal minimum wage were to go into effect. Let's not continue our hypocrisy here.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In the 110th Congress, the minimum wage was increased, and it included the Northern Mariana Islands. For the first time, the Northern Mariana Islands minimum wage was extended to the Northern Mariana Islands by federal law. At that time, the minimum wage was $3.05 an hour. It remains to this day, if you were to consider the Commonwealth wage laws, at $3.05 an hour. But it was also difficult to go in the same increase as it is in the nation because of the Northern Marianas, the smallness of our economy, and it took employers time to adjust, and employees. So we worked with GAO, and they looked at every increase, and we were able to work out, and over a period of 11 years, just as of September of last year, so a period of 10 years, we made incremental increases, and we're now at $7.25 an hour. So September, October, November, December, January, five months ago, we reached the U.S. minimum wage. Now, I'd like to also say that the wage jumped once again from $3.05 an hour in 2007 to $7.25 an hour in September of last year. But our economy did not collapse because we were able to make these incremental steps in the raising of minimum wage. And as a matter of fact, our economy grew. We have more U.S. workforce today in the Americans in the workforce, despite or maybe because of the increase in minimum wage. But having just doubled the minimum wage, I believe it is necessary to pause and allow businesses to adjust and expect when the next schedule increases after the Government Accountability Office is able to analyze the numbers they have in terms of the size of the economy, the business size, and the number of workers that will be affected by the increase. We're not saying that the Marianas should get no increase. We're just saying that it would take incremental steps. And I'm grateful that we're able to get this. Additionally, for the information of the committee, it was I that asked the committee staff to talk to and meet with each of the territorial delegation congressional offices and ask for their thoughts on how they would like to be treated in the bill. And the committee staff met with each congressional office of the delegates. Finally, I'm not sure exactly what the ranking member means when she says teenagers in the Marianas are not going to be paid the federal minimum wage, because they are paid $7.25 an hour. If that's my understanding. So, Mr. Chairman, I ask for the defeat of the amendment, and I yield back to my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other comments? Gentlelady from North Carolina, you would withdraw your point of order?
I remove my point of order, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The question then is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from North Carolina. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. No. Noes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, can we have a recorded vote, please?
Recorded vote is requested and will be rolled to the end. Are there other amendments, gentlemen from Texas?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have an amendment.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 582, offered by Mr. Wright.
Mr. Chair, I reserve a point of order.
Gentlelady from North Carolina reserves a point of order. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I think we need to slow the rush to move this bill and consider the unintended consequences, one of which would be forcing employers to replace employees with artificial intelligence or automation, or force them to go to that quicker because of the economics forced on them by this bill. My amendment delays enactment of H.R. 582 and directs the Government Accountability Office to conduct a study on the employment and automation impacts of a $15 minimum wage and report the results to Congress within 1 year. It delays, not stops, the enactment of the bill. If the study concludes that H.R. 582 would result in job losses of 500,000 or more due to automation, it would not go into effect. A study published in the National Bureau of Economic Research found that increasing the minimum wage increases the likelihood that low-skilled workers in automatable jobs become unemployed. This finding extends to all industries, and studies show that the displacement of workers by automation and artificial intelligence is no longer limited to the manufacturing sector. Many fast food chains and grocery stores have replaced human employees with self-service kiosks and checkout lanes. There's a burger chain in Colorado that has replaced drive-through window attendants with fully automated artificial intelligent order takers. We've even seen Flippy, the robot who replaces human workers in the kitchen making hamburgers. It's simple economics. If you make employing real people more expensive than implementing automation, it won't be long before there's no longer a market for low-skilled workers, and millions of Americans are unemployed with few, if any, options left for employment. My amendment will ensure we're not adopting policies that disadvantage hardworking Americans. And I urge the members of this committee to vote yes on this amendment, and I yield back the rest of my time.
As time has expired, are there comments on this side? Chair recognizes himself then to point out that this amendment suggests that there will be job loss. All the studies show otherwise. And we shouldn't empower the Comptroller General to veto the next increase in the minimum wage. Furthermore, it eliminates the ability of employers to predict when the next minimum wage increase will take place. I yield back. Are there other comments? Gentlelady from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly oppose the amendment. While I absolutely share the concern about automation, we must always be mindful of how our policies affect the lives of everyday people. Automation will cost us jobs down the road, but as we heard from Professor Michael Reich at the hearing, raising the minimum wage will not necessarily accelerate automation. We do need to be prepared for this, and I think investing in our community colleges and our vocational and technical schools so that we get the skills for the jobs of the future and we're able to retrain our workforce is a priority. But if there was anything that I heard in this past year, it's that we can't wait. We have a situation in this country where the cost of living, the cost of educating our children, the cost of getting access to health care, that has dramatically outpaced people's earnings. And it's hurting people today. Delaying this any further will only exacerbate the income inequality gap that is already hurting our future. So I strongly oppose the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Are there other comments? Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just very briefly, and I appreciate the comments of the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, and could not agree more. But what I would say is this, that I spent a lot of time, and I'm sure many folks do in public policy, around the question of the dislocation in the labor markets because of automation, artificial intelligence, robotics. We've seen this for some time. In fact, we've seen it through the course of history. I think we're all troubled by the acceleration of innovation and what the displacement could be. But I would say this, that's coming whether we like it or not, whether you're comfortable with it or not. There have been dislocations in the buggy whip industry when internal combustion engines were invented as well. So it is a fact of life. It is something that I think public policy ought to be concerned about. I would say this, it seems to me that the answer to it, if you're a worker, particularly if you're in a low-skilled job, that the secret here is going to be marketable, to build your skill sets, to continue to invest in continuing education, and to take it upon yourself, and we should have employers take it upon themselves to make sure that their workers continue to be competitive and added value in the face of innovation, and putting more money in the pockets of employees so that they can pay for tuition and do things which enhance their abilities to be successful in that marketplace is exactly what this bill intends to do. I yield back my time.
This time has expired. Are there other comments? Gentlelady from North Carolina, do you withdraw your point of order?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I withdraw my point of order.
Question then is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Wright. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No. And noes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Gentleman requests a recorded vote, which will be rolled to the end. Are there further amendments? Does the gentleman from Tennessee have an amendment?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman is recognized to, just a minute, the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 582 offered by Mr. Rowe.
And gentlelady from North Carolina
Yes, Mr. Chair, I reserve.
reserves a point of order. Gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. This amendment suspends the provisions of H.R. 582 until the Government Accountability Office study is completed examining the impact of H.R. 582 on employment in geographic regions of the country that have a lower cost of living, such as rural areas where I live. The report to Congress would be issued within a year. GAO would examine regions with a median hourly wage of less than $18 an hour. If GAO would determine that the underlying bill will cause a reduction in employment of 200,000 or more jobs in these areas, the legislation will not go into effect. This amendment would ensure that the 107% minimum wage increase will not go into effect if it will cause significant job losses in regions of the country with lower costs of living as I live. Everyone here knows that the cost of living is not the same in every city, state, and community in the country, and everyone on this dais knows how much it costs to live back in your home district and how much it costs to live in Washington, D.C., at least part of the week, as we all do. My hometown of Johnson City, Tennessee, probably at the top end of the first congressional districts in terms of median income, But the cost of living is 96% more in Washington than it is where I live, and 117% more than someone who lives in Newport, Tennessee. If you look in San Francisco, probably $15 an hour is not the minimum wage. It should be more than that. The average one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco is $3,700 a month. $3,700 a month. The median price of a home there's $1.4 million. Well, the median price of a home where I live, again in the most affluent county in my district, is $148,000. And to mention, I just visited a TCAT, a Tennessee College of Applied Technology in Morristown, Tennessee, this Monday before I came back. 77% of those students who enter there graduate on time. 97% are placed in their specific line of work, and every single one of them graduate with zero debt. Just to give you one example, a new business has moved in. They're training welders there. The company is paying those welding students $16 an hour to go to school, to be hired after they're trained at $22 or $23 an hour. They're getting the skills that they need in our state to make a lot more than the minimum wage. And less skilled workers in entry-level jobs, Americans without a high school diploma or GED, and tipped workers would bear the brunt of the job losses, I believe, in my area. And let me just pass this along to you. In the recession, the Great Recession we just got over a few years ago, between 2010 and 2015, there are 3,100 counties in America. There were 167,000 new businesses formed during that 5-year period of time. 3,100 counties in America, 20 of them, 20, made up half of all the new business formations in this entire country. And almost 60% of counties, most of them rural, actually had a net business loss. So where I live, we're very sensitive to this. We can't lose any more businesses because we're losing our young people. And we owe it to American workers and small business owners to understand what the impact of a $15 minimum wage, and that's what this amendment really does. Under this amendment, if 200,000 jobs or more are lost in an area with lower costs of living because of the 107% increase in the minimum wage, then appropriately, the increases would not go in effect. And Congress can go back to enacting policies that will actually provide good-paying jobs for American workers. The legislation before us today is a calculated, politically motivated move, and I admit a good one, in the opposite direction of tangible benefits and far-reaching economic progress that every American in the community, as I just mentioned. The amendment will ensure that we're not harming our citizens in rural communities around the country by adopting a 107% wage increase in the federal minimum wage. And I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. My district covers areas that are very rural, from Cumberland, Maryland, to very urban, such as Potomac, Maryland. My company operates in 23 states, some which are high-cost states like Seattle, down to very lower-cost states like Columbia, South Carolina. But this amendment operates on a faulty premise that gradual wage increases set forth in this legislation, which will kick in over a 6-year period, could not be absorbed in certain areas of the country. It's flawed logic that feeds the argument there should be a regional minimum wage. There's no high-quality research to support the contention that this minimum wage increase cannot be absorbed. For example, minimum wage increase of the same magnitude as 582 were adopted in the 1960s, particularly with respect to workers that have been exempted in agriculture and service workers. These workers saw a doubling of their wages in a mere 4 years. In addition, the 2017 research paper by economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, a voluminous empirical research literature, has largely found that within the range of increases historically experienced in the United States, higher minimum wages have minimal employment effects. Echoing this, a paper published in the National Bureau of Economic Research examined 138 minimum wage increases since 1979, found no evidence of disemployment effects when the wage floor was set at higher levels in service industries. On the question whether lower wage states can absorb this increase, a recent study by a leading minimum wage economist found there be no net job loss in Mississippi from gradually increasing the minimum wage from $15 to $15 by 2024. The paper recently issued by the Center for Wage and Employment Dynamics at the University of California estimated the $15 minimum wage by 2024 would increase wages directly and indirectly for 44% of the workforce in Mississippi without adverse employment impact. The economic model used by the authors estimated both costs and benefits in raising the minimum wage. The costs included higher wages to business and a higher price to enterprises such as restaurants that are passed through to the customers, along with the impacts from substitution of equipment for labor. On the other hand, benefits included lower employee turnover, higher productivity, and most importantly, increased consumer demand driven by higher compensation levels. This increased demand was multiplied through the regional economy. The bottom line in Mississippi, at $15, the negative and positive effects largely offset each other, but the standard of living was measurably increased for 44% of the workers. I urge a no vote in this amendment, and I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. Are there other comments? The chair recognizes himself.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Excuse me. Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Yes, Mr. Chair. You'll strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to express my opposition to this misguided and what I think is a dangerous amendment. And I don't doubt the good intentions of the gentleman in offering it, but I do think it needs to be said and reiterated that this amendment would lock in many of the disparities that we see across our communities as it relates to wealth. Back in the 1930s, when the minimum wage was first proposed, President Roosevelt had to make a devil's bargain to get that bill approved by a Congress dominated by Southern segregationists. As a result, occupations that were dominated by African Americans were excluded from the minimum wage. For 30 years, this was true until the Civil Rights era forced us to correct yet another example of unjust treatment of our community. But the 30 years put our community even farther behind our counterparts, a gap that we still struggle to close. And now we debate this amendment that will disproportionately impact who? African Americans and other people of color. The research shows that 3/4 of the African Americans who will be impacted by the Raise the Wage Act live in areas that will be allowed to raise their minimum wage by less than $15 under this amendment. In short, once again, communities of color will receive the short end of the stick. Additionally, the idea of having multiple minimum wages in a single state puts our rural areas at a disadvantage. Workers would be incentivized to leave communities where the minimum wage is lower, possibly accelerating the brain and investment drain that we see today in many of our rural communities. Currently, law already allows our states and localities to have different minimum wages than the federal wage. Raise the wage will just ensure that we have a fair floor and an even playing field nationwide. We've already shown how $15 is the bare minimum needed to live in America. Allowing anything lower than that should be a non-starter for our committee, even more so if it's applied in a way that discriminates by race and by location. So I urge strong opposition to this amendment, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes himself to speak in opposition to the amendment. We shouldn't delay the minimum wage for this study. Studies have shown that at worst there'll be negligible job loss in passing this amendment. In fact, it's been pointed out that the recent study predicts that this bill will result in an increase in employment in Mississippi. We need to make sure that we have predictability on the scheduled increases so that businesses can prepare, and people shouldn't have to wait for the minimum wage increased based on a study or what their zip code is. Yield back. Are there any further comments? Gentlelady from North Carolina, do you withdraw your point of order?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I remove my point of order.
Question then is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will vote aye. All opposed, no? No. Noes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. That will be rolled to the end. No further amendments being offered. We'll now be voting on 8 amendments, including the amendment in nature of a substitute, and they will be called in order. First amendment, gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, offered an amendment. None of the minimum wage increases shall take effect prior to the effective date if any of the following occurs. The question is on the amendment. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Ms. Fudge? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Desagne? Mr. Desagne votes no. Mr. Norcross? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Strahan? Mrs. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Byrne? Mr. Grothman? Ms. Stefanik? Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Timmons? Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye.
Those are gentlemen from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, recorded.
Mr. Muser is not recorded.
Aye.
Mr. Muser votes aye.
Those are gentlemen from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney, recorded.
Mr. Courtney is not recorded. Mr. Courtney votes no.
Oh, there's a gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, recorded.
Mr. Guthrie is, Mr. Guthrie votes aye.
Gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Fudge.
Ms. Fudge is not recorded. Ms. Fudge votes no.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 14 yeas, 27 nays.
14 ayes, 27 nays. The amendment is not adopted. And I'll remind people that people who come in after the vote may record their vote with the clerk, so long as it doesn't change the outcome. The committee will now be in recess for 5 minutes. The next item on the agenda is the consideration of the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Minimum wage increases will not apply to respect enterprises who employ fewer than 10 individuals or a gross revenue of less than $1 million. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? No. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablan? Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Desagne? Mr. Desagne votes no. Mr. Norcross? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Timmons? Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? Gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands, Mr. Sablan, has he recorded?
Mr. Sablan is not recorded. Mr. Sablan votes no.
Mr. Norcross?
Mr. Norcross is not recorded. Mr. Norcross votes no.
Ms. Lee?
Mrs. Lee is not recorded. Mrs. Lee votes no.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 21 yeas, 24 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. The next item is the gentleman offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen, prohibits wage increases to the regular minimum wage, the youth minimum wage, tip minimum wage, and wages under 14C unless the unemployment rate for 16 to 24-year-olds is below 8% for each of the 12 months prior to their respective effective dates. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? No. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablan? Mr. Sablan votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSagne? Mr. DeSagne votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood?
No.
Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Timmons? Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye.
Are there any members not recorded?
Mr. Byrne is not recorded. Mr. Rooney is not recorded.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 20 yeas, 28 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The next amendment is offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker. States and local governments may not adopt a minimum wage requirement if an employer is exempt from such a requirement from paying the minimum wage under a bona fide collective bargaining agreement. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? No. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablan? Mr. Sablan votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSagne? Mr. DeSagne votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood?
No.
Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Timmons? Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 20 yeas, 28 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The next amendment to be considered is offered by the gentlelady from North Carolina, strikes a provision setting the effective date in the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands to be 18 months after the bill's general effective date. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? No. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablan?
No.
Mr. Sablan votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Desagne? Mr. Desagne votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood?
No.
Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Timmons? Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 20 yeas, 28 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The next amendment is offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Wright, delays the implementation of the act unless not later than 1 year after enactment. The Comptroller General submits a report on the impact of the act and its amendments made by the act on employment and automation. The report finds that the amendment made by the act will result in the loss of at least 500,000 jobs due to automation. The entire act will not take effect. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? No. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablan? Mr. Sablan votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Desagne? Mr. Desagne votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood?
No.
Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Timmons? Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 21 yeas, 27 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The next amendment is offered by the gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Rowe. The bill shall not take effect for 1 year or until the GAO issues a report on all metropolitan and non-metropolitan areas that have a median hourly wage of less than $18. If such a report finds that there will be a loss of at least 200,000 jobs in such areas, the legislation shall not take effect. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSagne? Mr. DeSagne votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood?
No.
Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Strahan? Mrs. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Timmons? Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 20 yeas, 28 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The question now occurs on the amendment in nature of a substitute. All in favor of the amendment in nature of substitute will say aye. Aye. All opposed, no.
No.
Madam Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment in nature of a substitute is agreed to. There being no other members to speak to the bill, I now entertain a motion to report the bill and recognize the gentlelady from North Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, I move the Committee on Education and Labor report the bill H.R. 582 to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute, and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and the bill as amended do pass.
Question now occurs on reporting H.R. 582 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. This is final passage. That's final passage. No, that, the.
I ask for a
final
recorded
passage.
vote, Mr. Chairman.
The recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll on final passage.
Chairman Scott?
Aye.
Chairman Scott votes aye. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes aye. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Chicano? Mr. Chicano votes aye. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. DeSagne? Mr. DeSagne votes aye. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes aye. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes aye. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes aye. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes aye. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes aye. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes aye. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes aye. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes aye. Mrs. Strahan? Mrs. Strahan votes aye. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes aye. Mrs. Fox?
No.
Mrs. Fox votes no. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes no. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes no. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes no. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes no. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes no. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes no. Mr. Timmons? Mr. Timmons votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no.
Is anyone not recorded? Is anyone not recorded?
Mr. Byrne is not recorded. Mr. Rooney is not recorded.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 28 yeas, 20 nays.
The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 582 is ordered reported to the House of Representatives, and the chair notes for the record that a quorum is present and recognizes the gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill as amended pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L. I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views.
Without objection, so ordered, and I ask unanimous consent that letters from the AFL-CIO and other letters, Bread for the World, and the Medicare Advisory, Long-Term Community Coalition, Justice and Aging, and Consumer Voice be entered into the record. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.